Good evening. Tonight, we will conclude our workshop series that was geared towards our parents who have students who have an IEP or a 504 plan, as well as to our community members who wanted to understand the processes of EC and 504. Tonight's focus will include understanding the myths and truths regarding the IEPs and 504s. Tonight, we will be joined again by Mrs. Tequila Jones, our whole child coordinator in Student Support Services NEC, as well as Mrs. Martha Stroud, our lead EC program specialist, and Mrs. Christy Grant, our executive director for Student Services NEC.
Good evening and welcome back to our series. We are going to recap some of the slides that we've shown in the previous two sessions in case you missed us. And we just kind of wanted to start with FAPE, which is a free appropriate public education. You may hear us say that acronym frequently throughout these slides. And if you look at our image here, the biggest circle encompasses all students in the district. And then we have a smaller group, which are just students with impairments, but they don't need a plan, they don't have an IEP, they may have an impairment that is being met by a healthcare plan. And then we have students, which is a smaller subset of our student population, which is students with substantial limitations, which is going to be those that qualify for a 504 plan. And then we have a much smaller circle, which depicts our students' population that needs specially designed instruction, which would be those students who would qualify and have an individualized education plan. So tonight we're going to go through a series of myths and then we're going to talk about the truths. These are things that we commonly see throughout our district that we have to work with parents on and sometimes our own staff. So as we go through the first myth is that every child who struggles needs and or is guaranteed a 504 or IEP.
So the fact is that IDEA and IEPs are based on three criteria that have to be met in order for a child to receive special education services. For a child to receive special education services or an IEP, it must be determined by a team that the student has a disability, that the disability has a negative educational impact, and that the student requires specially designed instruction to make progress in the general curriculum.
And also, fact, in order to be eligible for a 504, a student has to have a mental or physical impairment. And then that impairment has to have a substantial limitation on a major life activity. And some of the major life activities could be reading, being able to take care of oneself, being able to get along with peers, and things of that nature.
And I think the important thing to note there is that children may struggle through one particular concept or one particular standard that's taught in the curriculum. And it doesn't mean that they need more intensive services to help that child get through that or to learn those concepts or that goal that the regular ed teacher is working on. So we have our multi-tiered systems of support, which allows students in core instruction, all students to get support for whatever they need within that system. And if you think back to the circle we showed at the beginning, that would be that larger circle. And then we have what we call tier 2 interventions and supports, which would be those who need a little bit more than the supports offered within the core that would give them that support, having interventions geared toward what their needs are to close those gaps. And then we move into the IEP and 504. So just because your child struggles doesn't mean they need a plan, but it doesn't mean they don't need some further support within the regular education environment.
And so, just to reiterate, again, for a 504, you have to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits major life activities. And when we say substantially limits, we're talking about in comparison to other peers, to the peers in that classroom. And all we're looking at is to give that student an equal playing field. And so 504s are intended to provide equal access to the education, but it does not provide specially designed instruction. And just a reminder, we talked about this in previous presentations, there's no state or federal funding specific to 504, but the biggest takeaway for 504 is the limitation, how that impairment limits that student compared to their peers.
Miss Jones, can you give them some examples of a physical or mental impairment and what that major life activity would be? Because it's not always learning.
So, for example, and I'm gonna just use ADHD because that's very common. So, a student can have ADHD. That's a physical or that's a mental impairment, and so the student has a hard time focusing, has a hard time. They're easily distracted. They're not able to complete their assignments in the same amount of time as all their peers. And so then we will look at, okay, concentrating or thinking is a major life activity. Obviously, the student is struggling because all their other peers can finish their assignments in the allotted time that the teacher gives, but this student always struggles because they're easily distracted and always looking around. Now, the flip side of that is, let's say this child has ADHD, but all the students in the class need extra time to get their work done. It's not impairing his major life activity because all the students in his class, the teacher's having to give all of them extra time. So that's not an impairment for him at this time.
Which you may typically see in a kindergarten classroom.
Yes, you will see.
Especially at the beginning of the year.
And you want to make sure it's developmentally appropriate because in kindergarten, you expect a 5-year-old not to be able to sit for 30 minutes.
Right.
Okay. So just to contrast that with the IEP, some of the differences you're going to see are that for IEPs or individual education plans, a student must meet the criteria for one or more of 14 disabling conditions and require specially designed instruction. The IEP will also provide specially designed instruction based on individual student needs. And IEPs do come with state and federal funding. There's the costs associated, the staffing, the related services, all those things do require funding, and we are funded for those services.
And then for both IEPs and 504 provide accommodations, modifications, related services, and just making sure that students with disabilities have access to education on the same playing field as their peers.
Okay, so what's the difference between an IEP and a Section 504 plan before we jump into some more myths? Both an individualized education program or an IEP and a Section 504 plan serve our students with disabilities and provide whatever needed accommodations the team determines that they need to access their education. However, as Ms. Jones talked about, or Ms. Stroud, only students with IEPs receive specially designed instruction. And students can receive that specially designed instruction in a regular ed classroom along with their peers, or they could be removed from the regular classroom for a more intensive level of support, depending on what the team determines the child needs based on the data that they review. The specially designed instruction may include direct teaching in academics. It could also be in social emotional skills, organizational study skills, some functional skills, communication skills, and also motor skills if the child has a need for a service such as occupational therapy or physical therapy. So let's jump into another myth. Students who receive special education services have to be in a separate classroom, which would be a classroom that is separated from the regular education classroom.
Okay, so that is the myth. The fact actually is that IDEA, or the U.S. Special Education Law, says that students who require special education services should be able to remain in their classroom with their peers whenever possible. This concept is called least restrictive environment, or LRE. Research has shown that about 2/3 of students with learning disabilities spend at least 80% or more of their day in the general education classroom with all of their other students, basically, you're going to hear that if your child has an IEP, that's going to be talked about a lot. A lot of emphasis is put on LRE, and that's going to be determined by the location of services that where the services are provided for your child. Do they stay in their classroom? Are they moved to a small group or to a therapy room? So that's what LRE refers to.
Okay, thank you. The next myth is special education is only for students with severe physical or intellectual disabilities.
So, the fact, most students who have special education services do not have severe disabilities. The majority of these students have specific learning disabilities. This includes students with reading challenges such as dyslexia and those that struggle with math like dyscalculia. There are, as we said, 14 disabling conditions. They range in, range on a continuum of service severities from mild to moderate to severe. But most of our students can be educated with their peers most of the day. And the great majority of our students who are identified as having a disability have specific learning disabilities.
I would say our next probably largest population is our speech only students. So our students who qualify for speech and language services. Okay, next myth. The IEP is written by the school, then explained to the parents.
Okay, fact. According to federal law, IDEA, parents are full and equal members of the IEP team. You are an expert when it comes to understanding your child, and you have say in his or her IEP. One of the most important things and that we try to train with our staff is the importance of having parent input at the IEP meetings. We go to great lengths and we just encourage parent participation as much as possible. It's nice now that we do have the option for parents to participate virtually. That has really increased our parent participation, but it's just very important because, again, you are the expert when it comes to your child.
Okay, so the next myth. Section 504 requires a comprehensive formal evaluation to determine whether a child is disabled.
So the fact is that's not true. Although Section 504 evaluation may include a formal assessment, it is not required. Only an evaluation sufficient to provide information to determine the existence of a disability under Section 504 needs to be obtained. So we just need verification of a disability. So for example, if you're saying that your child has a mental health diagnosis, we would need documentation of that. And that we can simply, there's a form that we can give you to have the doctor fill it out to verify that this child does have that. And we will ask other questions about medication and things like that. The Section 504 team uses a lot of data to determine the appropriate disability and the services that the student may need. And so, for example, we'll look at teacher observations, we'll look at all of their academic data, grades, how they're doing on any benchmarks, how they've done historically. We even consider like attendance, is that a factor in why the students perform in the way? We would even consider any behavior data that we're able to obtain. If we need any information, we will ask maybe our school sites to do some observations with parent permission. But for 504, we try to collect as much data as we can to make a determination. If we even have a suspicion of a disability, we can collect that data and make that determination.
I think if we go back to a student with ADHD, which is a typical, and you referenced that earlier, that is one of the areas that if we don't necessarily need a medical diagnosis, can you talk about that a little bit?
So that's one of the things that a teacher, let's say, for example, says, I have this student, not a kindergartner, let's just say a fifth grader or a middle schooler that's coming in the class, they're having a really hard time struggling. I mean, they're struggling with paying attention. They really can't focus. It's not a behavior concern. We've ruled that out. It's not a discipline issue. When the child is sitting at their desk and they're trying to get their work done, they continuously look around. They continuously have to touch something on their desk. They have to be moving in some form. And they said, we have a concern. We can use that data. We can also involve our school psychologist to help us do a preliminary assessment to see if this student may have the characteristics of ADHD. Using that data can be used to determine disability and eligibility for a 504 and a 504 plan. Diagnoses are always helpful. Yeah. We do encourage parents to bring us whatever assessments or information they have to the table, but we don't have to just have a full evaluation from an outside source to make determinations for eligibility for 504 or 504 plans.
Thank you. Okay, the next myth. A medical diagnosis is required to determine whether a disability exists under section 504 for students with characteristics, and we just talked about this, of an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD.
So obviously, we just talked about that, and the answer is no. Again, it is helpful. Sometimes when you go to the 504 coordinator, which is typically the counselor, they may say, hey, do you have a diagnosis? Just to see what information you already have. But we do not have to have a formal diagnosis to give a student to be considered for a 504. Now, sometimes we could just even have a meeting to determine if we need more information. There are some specific diagnosis disabilities that we will need documentation, but those are typically your mental health or some of your health care. Like if you're saying a student has diabetes, obviously we would need that from a doctor. It would be hard for us to assess that as a team based off the data that we use in a school system. But we can still have a meeting to determine if more information is needed. So anytime you have a concern, you can bring that up, and a 504 meeting has to occur.
Yep, I think it's important to note too that just an ADHD medical diagnosis alone doesn't guarantee that that child qualifies for a Section 504 plan. Do you want to talk about that a
Yeah,
little bit?
so I always tell people 504, Section 504 is two prongs. First prong is, does my student even, is my student protected under Section 504? And that's when you go into, is there a physical or mental impairment? So child has ADHD, that is a mental impairment. Yes, your student is protected under Section 504. The second part of that is, does this student require a plan? The question of a plan comes in place when we start talking about major life activities. So in my previous example, the student struggling has all the characteristics of ADHD. As compared to their peers, they're not doing well, not just academically, behavior-wise, and their characteristics are not matching that of the peers. And so then we would say, okay, the student may be affecting the student's major life activity. Let's go through the process to determine if the student needs a plan. Same student, kindergarten, but everyone in that classroom is off task and can't focus for longer than 20 minutes. It's not affecting a major life activity as compared to their peers, then that student it may be determined that student does not need a plan per se, but they are still protected under Section 504, which speaks to discrimination against their disability.
Yep, and so the diagnosis alone is just one source of data, and we have to look at different, because we have seen children that come in with outside diagnosis, and we don't have any of those same concerns based on observations or the teacher reports within the school. So we do consider everything, we look at everything, but know that we use multiple data points in order to make that determination.
And kids change too, just to add to that, Christy, because we can always revisit. Just because we have a 504 meeting to determine a student is not even eligible under Section 504, anything that changes with that student throughout the year or the following years, we can always revisit and have that conversation again.
Which leads us right into our next myth. A reevaluation under Section 504 in IDEA must be conducted every year.
Okay. Actually, the fact for that would be that a reevaluation only needs to be conducted when, for IDEA, now this would just be for a student with an IEP that qualifies for special education. For those students, a reevaluation must occur every 3 years or as necessary. Minimum every 3 years. However, if a parent provides new information, or if there are changes, just like with the 504, if there are changes in any circumstances or the child's needs change significantly, a reevaluation can be requested and completed by the team. For Section 504, I guess the language, correct me if I'm wrong, but the language says as necessary or periodically. I think in North Carolina, we say that 3-year determination would satisfy that periodic requirement. So again, just as with the IDEA requirement for special education services, Section 504s in North Carolina are revisited for reevaluation every 3 years. And it's important to remember, though, for either, it may or may not mean that additional formal testing is needed. We call it a reevaluation, and people, I think, often get confused and think, well, it's going to mean testing, but that's not always the case. Basically, the reevaluation, just the process of collecting data, reviewing eligibility, and progress monitoring and reviewing the IEP or the 504 plan, that constitutes an evaluation by definition in and of itself. So the process of reevaluation may or may not involve testing, which is it can be a little bit confusing, but sometimes the IEP teams can look at the data that they have, and we're able to collect so much data now just without formal testing. But a lot of times we don't need to request additional assessments like achievement tests or things like that. So just keep that in mind. It does get a little confusing, but we just want to make sure that these eligibilities are revisited every 3 years.
And just to add that for 504, sometimes if it's a medical diagnosis or a mental diagnosis, we may ask for updated, because if we have a 5-year-old that was diagnosed, sometimes by the time they reach 3rd grade, the diagnosis may have changed, or like if they were a diabetic, some things may have changed with them medically. So we may ask for updated medical information for our revals for 504s.
And we also in this county do a reevaluation anytime we have a child that moves to us from another county, just so that we can review all of the data or any type of progress monitoring and IEP goals that the former district has had as well. So that would be another time that may occur earlier than that 3 years, but would fall under that as necessary in our county. Okay, we get this question a lot. The myth would be that a student with an IEP or Section 504 plan cannot be suspended.
So I think this is probably one of my favorite ones as a former administrator. IDEA does not say that a student cannot be
or
suspended,
Section 504.
or Section 504 either, saying that a student cannot be given consequences for violating any school rules, just like any other student. However, it does say that it cannot do that if the consequence will mean moving the child to a different placement and the behavior, was part of their disability. So, for example, if we're saying that a student has a diagnosis, and I'm gonna just use ODD because that's very common.
Tell them what it is.
Oppositional defiant disorder, and there are certain characteristics with oppositional defiant disorder that could be looked at like a student, may not follow rules. That's one of the characteristics. And so one of the issues that the student is having is following directives from a teacher for specific rules because they don't want to, right? And so we would have a manifestation meeting once a child exceeds 10 days of out of school placement or out of their learning environment placement. And during that conversation, there are a series of questions that get asked about the student's disability as it relates to the incident. Sometimes it's found to be a manifestation, which means that that student's behavior from that referral was a result of their disability. Sometimes it's not. I'm gonna go back to ADHD. That's a great example. So characteristics of ADHD is unable to focus, inattentiveness, hyperactivity, things like that. But if you're getting into a fight and you're getting into several fights, that is not necessarily a manifestation of your disability, right? Because we can look at how did the fight happen, what happened before the fight, did you have time to kind of think about it and process it before you, because some people say, well, it's impulsive, but did you have time, was there time in between before you could have made a decision to get into that altercation? There are special circumstances that regardless of your disability, you will receive that consequence, and you can also be considered for out of school placement for long term or placed in an alternative learning environment. And those are such as things as having a gun or a weapon, causing bodily harm, or drugs. And so those three things are considered special circumstances, and regardless of your disability, you will receive that that consequence and more if it's deemed that it was that serious in the circumstances following that.
And that's a 45-day placement.
Yes.
So even if it is a manifestation of the child's disability and the violation, the school rule that was violated based on the code of conduct was drugs, weapons, or seriously bodily injury, then automatically the child could be placed and removed to a different environment for up to 45 days.
So just to make it simple, yes, a student with an IEP or 504 can be suspended, but we do have safeguards in place and processes that we have to follow to ensure that the behavior is not a direct result of their disability. And so we do have processes that everyone is aware we have to follow for that.
Yeah, and in North Carolina, when you talk about the change of placement, a change of placement is determined when it is a more than 10 days of out of school suspensions cumulatively. If it's the same, you might have to help me with this.
So when it's the same type of behavior,
yes,
and they're within close proximity of each other. So for example, a student may have aggressive behavior incident 2 in October. But then they don't have any other issues until April. And it's aggressive behavior. They're not close in proximity. However, that same student can have issues in October, aggressive behavior, disrespect to staff, disorderly conduct. Those are kind of similar in nature. They do it in October, again November. December comes, they done hit 13 days of suspension. They were all three close in proximity. You look at the referral, similar characteristics and behavior. Then now we have to have a manifestation and have a conversation.
Right, because it's beyond the 10 days.
Beyond the 10 days.
Or if it's a recommendation for long-term or a change to another site, which would be definitely
Yes.
beyond the 10 days.
And this is for IEP and 504, section 504.
So the short answer to that is just because a student has an IEP or a section 504 does not mean they cannot be suspended. They can up until those 10 days. We just start to monitoring those days, and the team can meet. And I think the last time, the session that we did, we talked about a functional behavior assessment and a behavior intervention plan, which could hopefully help some of the behaviors that the child is dealing with and replace those behaviors with appropriate behaviors.
And also too, we also do a lot of transition plans. Don't panic, ask questions, but sometimes you hear us say, let's place a student in another environment or alternative setting for so many days to give them a reset, and then we do a transition plan back to school full time. But that's, again, those are all those things that take place in manifestation meetings.
Okay, let's move on to our next myth. We could talk about that for a while. Students who receive special education services will most likely not graduate with a regular high school diploma. That is the myth.
No, that is not true at all. We know that more than 80% of students with disabilities can meet grade level expectations with the right support. Students receiving special education should be set up for success to graduate. Remember, we talked about that least restrictive environment. Again, we want our students, the majority of our students, to be out there in gen ed the most of the day, but if they have to be removed just for a minimal part of the day, so they should be able to meet grade level standards. They need that grade level curriculum. They will get a diploma just like any other high school student if they meet the requirements. And hopefully through the support of an IEP, if they do have a disability, the support of an IEP would help them achieve that goal. Actually there's really about only 1%. It can exceed it, but we try the aim is for us no more than 1% of our students who receive instruction on a alternate curriculum. So they receive a graduation certificate, but that is only a very small percentage of our students, and those are the ones that have the most severe and the most significant types of disabilities, physical as well as cognitive or intellectual disabilities. So really, most of our students, the majority of students with IEPs, are going to graduate with a diploma as long as they meet the requirements.
I was going to talk about occupational courses study
Okay,
diploma really
Mm-hmm.
quick. So I think it is important to note that in North Carolina, we do have a occupational course of study, which is considered a regular high school diploma, but it is for students with individualized education plans or IEPs who really are looking to go to possibly a 2-year community college, but more into the world of work upon graduating. But that is still considered a regular high school diploma in North Carolina only.
And I'm just going to ask Ms. Stroud to just tell us what is gen ed, because we're educators, so sometimes we use shortened words. What is gen ed?
Well, gen ed just stands for general education, and so that's any student who follows that standard course of study or even the occupational course of study. That's the difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, our next myth. Teachers can decide whether or not they will implement an IEP or 504 plan, or whether they'll even teach a student with a disability at all. Now, that's definitely a myth if you didn't hear me say that in the beginning.
So if a student has an IEP or a 504 plan, the school staff is required to implement it. Teachers may not refuse to have a student with a disability in their classroom. That would be illegal, just as it would be for them to refuse to teach a student based on race, gender, or religion. You cannot discriminate against a student just for having a disability, for having an IEP or having a 504 plan. All of our teachers are trained to work with students who have all kinds of disabilities, so that should never happen. I don't think it's ever happened here. I hope not. Should never happen. So teachers can never refuse to teach a particular student with just because they have a disability.
So just to reiterate what you said, IEPs and 504 plans are legal documents, and teachers and educators in the building are required to follow that. And they also sign off that they receive a copy of it.
Yes.
And acknowledge that they have it.
Okay, our next myth. The school system is only required to provide a regular school bus for my child.
The fact is, if a child attending a neighborhood school has no problems on a regular bus, then there's no reason that they would need to take a special bus. An IEP team may determine that some children need specialized transportation in order to access their education. So there's a couple of reasons that will come up. One, of course, if a student is using any type of related service device, so I'm thinking of a wheelchair, or the student has some issues